Hey there, Prakash, head of product of Xano here again, and we are finally on part 3 of our 3-part series of taking your idea and morphing it into an app. As always, Xano is focused on the backend architecture, and in video 1 we went over the database and how you really take those ideas and morph them into database tables. The second video, we covered the basics of an API, and that is the messenger that takes data to and from your database table to the front end. And the final thing that we're covering today is by far and away the most complex topic of interacting with data from the outside world or from a third-party API. Now, it's complex because the real world of third-party services is complex. They don't always give you data in the way that you want, and so you have to really transform it to make it work for you. But that's why people love Xano so much, because you can do all of that and really make any sort of, or take any sort of data from a third-party service and just use it in your application. So, at this point, you kind of understand the whole notion of the front end versus the back end. Xano handles everything in the back end, and today we're going to really get into the business logic and working with those third-party services. So I mentioned that I always like to start in the whiteboard, and this just basically draws out how the application works. You'll know that we have a loyalty card application where you can go to your favorite restaurant or store and use a deal at that restaurant. We have the API, which has the basic CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete. So this API can take data to and from the database table based on what the front end is commanding it and do these basic commands over here. Now, for working with a third-party service, I want to introduce some new complexity. So let's say I wanted to not only get the merchants that I have stored in my database, but I actually wanted to just get a bunch of restaurants so my users can use their app to look at all of the restaurants in their area. So not only restaurants, but restaurants by zip code, right? It doesn't make sense for me to store all restaurants for all zip codes in the US where we are right now. It makes sense for me to use a third-party service to do that. So I happen to know that Zemedo or Zomato has an API that you can sign up for and get an API key for that allows you to see all of the restaurants for a given area. But unfortunately, if you look at, for example, their restaurant search, they do not, if you look at their inputs, they don't take a zip code. They take this thing called an entity ID. Well, how do you get an entity ID? Well, you have to use another endpoint that they have, API endpoint, and you have to put in a city name, and then it will give you an entity ID, which then you can use to search the restaurants. So we need to use yet another service that takes that zip code and translates that into a city name so we can feed it into Zemedo to then get that entity ID and get the restaurant. See, I wasn't lying when I said it was going to be a doozy, but this is just how it works in the real world. If you're wondering where I got these APIs from or how I found them, there's a great site called public-apis.io that lists a ton of APIs based on what your need is. There's many sites like this, but this is a great one. There's truly an API for everything if you aren't building one yourself. Okay, so let's go back to the whiteboard, and I'm going to paste this in, and this is basically what I just talked about, but step by step. I always like to think about the commands or the functions that I'm going to use in my API to really understand how I'm going to build it line by line in that Xano function stack in the API. So again, I'm training the API how to get restaurants by zip code. It's going to take a zip code from the user. It's going to use this Zippopotamus and translate that to a city name. Then in step 2, it's going to take that city name and get an entity ID associated with that city. And then finally, it's going to return the results of the restaurant using that entity ID. Okay, let's get it done. So in Xano, here are all the different API endpoints that I have here. I want to actually not modify any of the CRUD operations. I want to start from scratch. So I'm going to click Add API Endpoint, and I'm going to click Start from Scratch, right? I'm not even touching the database for this exercise. I'm just going to start right from scratch. And then for the name, if I look at what I want to do, I want to get restaurants by zip code. So I'm just going to say get, I'll just shorten it, resto by zip. Okay, get resto by zip. And I'm going to click save. That's probably a lame name, but it doesn't matter. You get the idea. Okay, so in my get restaurants by zip code, here's the structure. First thing, like we covered in the last video, is there a query parameter? Yeah, there is. I want to take a zip code from the user. So I'm going to hit plus. It's an integer because it's a set of numbers. And now I'm just going to say zip code. Okay, so now I can click save. Now comes the fun part, the function stack, where I start building this out. So the function stack here, if I hit plus, I can say external API request. Because remember, I'm going to access Zippopotamus or Zippo to take a zip code and give me a city back. So here, this is an open API, meaning I don't have to sign up for anything to get an API key, whereas in Zemedo, I do. It depends. Some places or some APIs usually make you sign up to give so they can authenticate and keep track of who's using their API endpoints. Zippopotamus just doesn't care, so that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and use it right now. So I'll just go ahead and copy this from Zippopotamus. Actually, I want to take this full URL over here. So this HTTP, I'm going to copy that, and I will then go to back to Xano and put this in the URL. I could have actually done it without the HTTP as well. It would have still worked, but I just want to be proper here. So you'll see here that it's already pre-populated 90210, which I know is Beverly Hills. So for example, if I did nothing else and I ran this, and it doesn't even matter that I'm putting anything there because I haven't linked these two things together, and I hit run, I'm going to go all the way down and I can see it's Beverly Hills. Okay. So I don't want to hard code it as Beverly Hills. I want to use what the user is giving me. So there's two things that I want to do here. I want to take out this 90210, and I'm going to put %s. %s is a way to tell Xano that you're going to use a variable. %s is typically used when you want to use text, like a string, and you'd use %d for an integer. But I usually like to use %s because it's blanket. It covers numbers and text. So then how do I then tell it to map to this input that we're getting? Well, we're going to use a filter called sprintf. This is very popular in programming, but basically all you need to know that it does is it takes that %s and it replaces it with whatever you want. So I'm going to hit plus. I'm going to hit this drop down, and then I'm going to go to our inputs. We only have one input, which is their zip code, and I'm going to click update. So now this is going to use whatever I type in for the zip code. The second thing that I want to do is I want to change the output. Right now, this is reading as API1 or returning as API1. I want to put or rename it to something a little bit more apparent to me. So I'm just going to say Zippo, right? Because that's the response that I'm getting. And then here in the return, what I'm going to do is I'm going to return this Zippo over here, and I'm going to return it as Zippo. And the reason I'm doing that is because in the API, I want it to make sense when I'm sending it to my front end, right? So I'm going to put my my zip code, which is 93101, which is Santa Barbara, and I'm going to go ahead and hit run. And you'll see that it's returning as Zippo, and there's all of this stuff that's coming back. So the request is what I'm sending over. I don't necessarily want that. The response is what I'm getting back from Zippo. This is basically the structure that you're going to get when you hit third-party APIs. It's not all API responses are created equal, but you can expect something like this. The response is all captured here, and I don't need the headers. That's like the envelope information around the response. What I care about is this, in places, Santa Barbara, right? This is what I'm going to use to pass into Zemedo to get that entity ID to then search for restaurants. So I am going to just take a good glance at this, and I'll actually copy this result as JSON. I'm basically going to copy all of this because we're going to do something with it right now. Okay, so now that I have this working, we're at a good pausing point. If you only care about getting basic data and then feeding it back, guess what? We've just done that. You could take this endpoint URL and connect this to your front end. But we're going to keep going. For those of you that want the full complexity, we're going to keep building right now. Okay, so we got a pretty big response from Zippo. And remember, we only want that city name. We don't want everything like the headers and the request body or everything like that. So I'm going to show you a couple ways to do that in this video. But one of the things that I want to do is I want to take Zippo and I want to store it in something and then just get the name part. So I'm going to click add to the function stack. I'm going to do data manipulation, and I'm going to create a variable, right? A variable is something that you can store data in. And this little visual bug right here, ignore it, just pretend like there's just one of them. Basically, we're going to store what's in Zippo, and we're going to tell it, I don't care about anything except for that city name. So I'm going to change this from var1 or variable 1, and I'm just going to say Zippo city name, okay? And then here in the value, I'm going to select the variable Zippo. That's what I'm getting as the response from this API request. And I'm going to click this thing called subpath. This is pretty cool what we're going to do. What this allows me to do is paste in that response that I copied from Zippo. And then it allows me to traverse the response to get exactly what I want. So I'm going to go inside the Zippo response. I'm going to go into, let's see, the response here. I'm going to go into the result. I'm going to go into places. I'm going to go into 0th, which is the first. 0 is really the first response that we're getting. And then I'm going to go into place name. Okay, so I got all of this information here. And I actually don't need this first Zippo. I only need, because it's not Zippo.Zippo, it is Zippo.all of these things. So I just accidentally copied it from the previous response. So anyways, we have all of this here, Zippo city name, and now I'm going to click save. So Zippo city name is this variable that I've created that just takes the city name out of Zippo. So in this response, we're right now returning the results of that API request. I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to add instead, using this dropdown, Zippo city name. So if I've done this right and I run it, I should only get back the name Santa Barbara, or the word Santa Barbara, or the city rather, and it works. Okay, so I'm getting back Santa Barbara here. Okay, so what this is doing so far is it's using Zippopotamus. It is getting the zip code, it's getting the city name, and we've stored it in a variable and we're returning it. Now let's start using Zemedo. So we're going to add yet another external API request, okay? And now I got to fill out this information. So going to Zemedo, as I mentioned before, you have to basically get an API key from them, and you can get it by signing up. And this is true for most services, as I mentioned. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, because in the documentation, in most third-party documentation, it's going to look like something like this. It's going to give you all of their APIs, all of their messenger commands that they know, and you can test them out in the documentation. So I know for a fact that I want to look for locations that they support. So I'm going to do this get locations here. And basically what they take in, or what they require, is a user key and a query, which is the city name. So if I type in, for example, that user key, and I just type in Santa Barbara, and I try it out, if I scroll down, I'm going to see the response that they're giving me. Location suggestions is Santa Barbara, California. That's exactly what I want. Okay, so let's do this back in Xano. So in Xano, remember, I got to fill out all this information. And the URL actually is nested right over here. This is exactly what I could put out to query. So I could do this and build out the headers manually. However, Xano supports this thing called import curl. So I can copy the curl command, and curl stands for command line URL. In almost every third-party service, you're going to have it. I can just copy this directly, and I can click import curl, and I can just click import. So it automatically builds out everything for me. Now, if I didn't, for whatever reason, have a curl command, I would just, again, build out these headers by pushing in the accept value and the user key. And I know that because I can see that that's what it's asking for over here, these two header values. Okay, back to the example. So with Zemedo, if I look at the URL, it's hard-coded as Santa Barbara. Again, I don't need it hard-coded as Santa Barbara. I want to use what is coming through the Zippo city name. So I'm going to do something that won't work just to show you an example, and then I'll show you how to do it properly. You'll notice that this Santa Barbara has a %20 in between the two words, and that is because in the URL on the web, they don't allow just natural spaces. So let me show you what you would probably think that you would do, which is you would put this %s, you'd go to add filter, remember that sprintf thing that I showed you? And then you would select that Zippo city name, right? So that's right over here, Zippo city name. So what that's going to do is that's going to replace that %s with Santa Barbara, right? So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to run and debug this, 93101. And actually, I need to, see, I didn't even follow my own rule. I want to rename this to something more meaningful here. I'm just going to call this Zemedo. I think we're going to get EntityID, right? That's what we're going to get once we put in that city name. So I'm going to do that, and instead of returning the city name, I'm going to remove this, and then again, I'm going to add this Zemedo EntityID. I'm going to hit save, and then when I run and debug this, it's not going to work. Okay? So if I go down, you see status 400. That means that it's not detecting anything because you can see there's a space here in Santa Barbara. Remember, in the Zomato API, I can see I need that percent 20 in between the two words. So how do we do that within Xano? I click right over here, and then where we have query, I'm just going to remove that where I see query. And then I'm going to take away the sprintf thing, and I'm going to use another filter. And that filter is going to be called URL add argument. I'm adding an argument on a URL, and it's automatically going to sanitize what I bring in. So right here, for the key, I'm going to type query. And again, that's because it's asking here query. And then I don't need to put in an equals. I just need to put in the value, and that value, now I can say, is the Zippo city name. So I know that was complicated, but it's important that you understand because you're going to be working with this stuff when you are out in the real world working with these third-party services. So I just went ahead and did that. I'm going to click save. So now that that is done, I'm going to hit run, and when I run this, I'm going to, see, I get all this stuff back. But then when I go back, I can see in the result this entity ID, which is associated with Santa Barbara, California. We are almost done. One more thing that I wanted to tell you. In this API request, notice here how I have this user key. This is my personal key that I just have for everyone to see. This is not best practice. You want to typically store this in what's called an environment variable, or like in a vault that Xano keeps. So just to show you best practice, I'm going to copy this key. I don't have to do it. I could keep building, but I want to really teach you the best way to do these things. I'm going to go into settings. I'm going to go to environment variables here. I'm going to click manage, and I'm going to hit add a variable. So this, I'm just going to call this the Zemedo key, and then I'm going to paste in that value, and I'm going to hit save. So now, when I go back to my API and get resto by zip, and I click on this one, I'm going to replace this with that %s that I told you about. Remember? %s. I'm going to add filter. I'm going to do sprintf. And then here, when I add the argument, I'm going to hit this over here, and then I'm going to go to this environment variable Zemedo key. And there we go. So now it's going to work. Okay, so now that we've done that, you would think that the next thing that we need to do is store this information in a variable to get just the entity ID. We actually don't need to store it in a variable. I just showed you that to go over best practices. We can go straight into the next API request and still use that fancy subpath thing that I showed you. Let me go through it right now. So in this, we've done this part. We've taken that zip code. We've gotten the entity ID. Now we're going to search for restaurants. All right. One more API request. We are getting through this. So I'm going to add one more external API request. And so I don't forget, I'm going to do the output now. I'm just going to call this restaurants, right? Because that's what we're going to be getting back from this API request. I'm going to go back to Zemedo. I'm going to copy my API key here. And then I'm done with locations. Now I want to go to searching for the restaurants over here. So remember, this requires that entity ID key, or sorry, the key. The entity ID, so I know Santa Barbara. I think it's still stored here, is it? Yes, it is. Great. 526, that's Santa Barbara. Okay. So if I go over here and I just type in 526, and then I have to just tell it that it's a city. Okay. So when I do that and I try it out, please work. Is it working? Oh, no content. Let's see. What did I do wrong? So query. Oh, I think I just have to type in like a restaurant. Maybe I'll just type in like a taco. Let's see if that works. Try it out. There we go. Cool. So yeah, so it got it's getting taco stands. Great. So now here, remember, I can take this curl command. So first of all, let me explain. It requires a user key, an entity ID, a city, and then a search keyword. I didn't think that you needed one of these, though, so let me just try this one more time, and I think it's just going to return. Yeah, that's super weird. I'm not sure why I did that the first time, because it would have said required. Anyways, hopefully you're still following. This is what we need. I can take this curl command again. I'm going to take this curl command. I'm going to go into Xano, and then here, remember, I already called it restaurants. In the curl command, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import the curl, and I'm just going to paste it in here, and then I'm going to click import. Okay, great. So here I can see the entity ID is hard-coded, and so is the city. I'll leave the city the way it is. I'm always going to be looking at cities, but the entity ID is something that I need to replace. And because there's no spaces between an entity ID, I can use that special %s, and I can get that directly from this Zemedo entity ID. Now, when I click that %s, I can add the filter, right? And then I can do sprint f. And then here in additional arguments here is where I can select the entity ID and do the subpath. But I actually forgot to copy the response to do the subpath. So let me go back and do this. So I'm just going to save it. I'm going to leave it the way that it is. I'm going to hit this little I for a visibility thing just to not use this line item in the function stack. And I want to get this entity ID response. So when I run this right over here, it's going to give me back this massive response. I'm going to copy this. Now I'm ready to go back. I'm going to unhide it. I'm going to go back in here. Here we go. So instead, remember, I put that %s. I'm just going to go sprint f. And then in the additional arguments, I am going to change this to this entity ID subpath. I want to paste in that whole response. I want to go into the response. I want to go into the results of that response. I want to go into, the location suggestions, the 0th one, and I want to go into city name, right? So remember, in the last example, I used a variable. This one, I just went straight to it. I'm using the same concept. I don't need to store the data. I can just put it directly in here. Okay, so it's going through everything. That's looking good. I'm going to hit update. This is all looking good. Remember, instead of using this key, I can just do this %s again, and then finally do my environment variable, which is right over here. Okay, great. So now best practice. I've done everything. I'm going to click save. Wow, this has been a doozy. So here I'm returning this. Remember, I can just I could choose to actually add on to this response, but I just want to make it really clean, and I only want my restaurants back, which I just named this. So I'm going to click save. I'm going to run this, and I should see the results of the restaurant. So if I go back, I'm seeing a result 400. So Santa Barbara, oh, entity ID. I put in the city instead of the entity ID. Nice one. So let's try that again. So here we go. Entity ID %s. Okay, let's make sure that I have this right. So here, what we want to do is I want to go into entity ID. I'm going to click the subpath. I'm going to paste in that large response. Result. What was I doing? Location suggestion 0, entity ID. There we go. Update. Save. Okay. See, it's not easy working with a third-party service. You got to keep going back and testing. The cool thing is we have a debugger and you can kind of see what's going on. Okay, so I just ran that. I'm going to collapse the headers. I get the results. See, I'm getting all the restaurant names here. So yeah, now we've gotten all the restaurant names, and we can connect this to the front end, knowing that if we put in a zip code, it's going to return all of the restaurants. One more thing that we can do. I can copy this response over here because, again, when we push this to our front end, we don't want to send all this data to the front end. We may just want to send the names of the restaurants. So why can't we do that? Good news is we can. So I'm going to click this restaurant thing here. And again, it's returning just all of restaurants, everything. But I want to go into the subpath, and I'm going to start traversing through that subpath. So I want to go into the response. I want to go into the result. I want to go into the restaurants, right? I want to go into the 0th result. I want to finally go into restaurant, and then I want to go into, where's name? There's the restaurant name. So how did I know all that? I could have looked at the response, but sometimes they usually name it in an obvious way to where you could just do it. I literally didn't remember. I was just going through, but it turns out that I got it right. So I want to show this to you. This is going to get only the first restaurant. Watch, I'll save it right now so you can see it. I'm going to run it, and then it's only going to give me one restaurant name, right? But I want all of them. So pretty straightforward. If I want all of them, just delete this 0, right? So this is all the dot notation. This basically says return an object with all of the restaurants that you're getting. So I'm going to run this and notice that I get, if this all worked, all of those restaurants. And that's what I want to send to my front end, right? I now connect that to a front end, and I get all of this. And it's going to ask for a zip code, and it's going to give you all of those restaurants back. Whew, that was a lot of work, but I hope that you understand how with Xano you can take APIs from or third-party APIs, bring in the data, and transform them to your will. So thank you for sticking with me. If you've watched all the way, truly appreciate it. Now you are a Xano API master, and I can't wait to see what you get up to. Thanks again, and we will talk soon.